Continuing on from where we left off regarding the commentary of Al-Fiqh Al-Akbar, At-Taftazani is reported as having said, and the knowledge of the scholars of the companions, meaning of the prophetic companions, the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, enters into that discipline of rational theology. For indeed it is kalam, rational theology, and even if it was not named so in that era with this name, just as their knowledge with the actions of the religion is fiqh, jurisprudence, even if it did not exist with this ordering and authoring of it in the time of the companions. This reflects the orthodox Sunni or the orthodox Ash'ari and Maturidi position that the companions in fact did know the science of theology. However, their kind of theology may not have been the same as the kind of theology that they, the Ash'aris and the Maturidis, employed, but in essence it is the same, even if it was not named as rational theology or as kalam or as falsafa. And the example or analogy that is commonly given here is that fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, existed in the time of the companions, even if it was not called jurisprudence in the time of the companions, but rather their knowledge of the actions relating to the religion of God is still encapsulated within the broad terminology and the broad meaning of the word fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence. A very obvious issue with this definition is that whilst this is correct and true for scriptural theology, the same cannot really be said for rational or philosophical theology, because rational philosophical theology is a much later development. However, it's interesting to note that some Ash'aris and Maturidis and those from that tradition would argue that they were aware of this science of rational or speculative theology, but they did not use it as it was not needed in their time. This of course seems to me to be historical back projecting and simply imposing their own understanding of what orthodoxy is upon the prophetic companions. The truth is that the prophetic companions do not think too deeply regarding creedal matters. They simply, as the Quran describes, سَمِعْنَا وَأَطَعْنَا, heard and we hear and we obey. The companions did not delve too deeply into the meanings or realities of Islamic creed. Rather, they simply affirmed what they felt was obligated upon them by God and His Messenger to affirm as religious creed. An important discussion then comes up regarding Abu Hanifa, who supposedly authored this book. Did he author this book or not? And was he engaged in this kind of rational theology? It's important to know that Abu Hanifa was born in the year 80 Hijri, 80 of the Islamic calendar, and he passed away in the year 150 of the Islamic calendar. So whilst he did live in quite an early time period and in the early Islamic period, the development of rational theology was simultaneously occurring in his time. And certain aspects of this rational theology and certain aspects of the philosophical tradition of the Islamic world had already begun to develop in this time period. And as such, Abu Hanifa was one of the first proponents of what you could call Sunni orthodox theology. Of course, Abu Hanifa's relationship with kalam, with rational and speculative theology, was pretty complicated, as there are many narrations from him in which he denounces it and he denounces those who engage in it. However, it's important to take quite a nuanced perspective to this, as there are narrations in which he does engage in rational theology as well, and he is well known, as we shall discuss, to have supposedly at least authored Al-Fiqh Al-Akbar and other works like it. Abdul Qahir al-Baghdadi in Usul ad-Din mentions the first of the theologians from the jurists and heads of the schools of thought are Abu Hanifa and Ash-Shafi'i. For indeed, Abu Hanifa wrote a book in refutation of the Qadariyah, which he named Al-Fiqh Al-Akbar. Hence, classical Islamic scholarship generally agreed upon the fact that Abu Hanifa wrote Al-Fiqh Al-Akbar. What has come in later times from the likes of the Salafis and their polemical and sectarian argument that Abu Hanifa did not write Al-Fiqh Al-Akbar, in reality it can be very easily disproven, but also it seems to me to be a case of historical back projecting, that they don't want Abu Hanifa to have said the things that he said in Al-Fiqh Al-Akbar, as they tend to go against the Salafi creed, hence they will make these kinds of arguments. The reality is that Abu Hanifa did believe these things that he mentions in this work of his, and that they tend to go against the more athari or textual understanding of Islamic creed as propounded and proposed by the likes of Ahmad ibn Hanbal and the Ahlul Hadith movement. And the Ahlul Hadith movement were well known for criticizing Abu Hanifa, so it really shouldn't be too difficult to understand the fact that Abu Hanifa had a very different understanding of Islamic creed than what many of the Hanbalites and the Atharis said. And so Salafis are wrong to back project their own understanding of Islamic creed onto Abu Hanifa, and to thus deny that Abu Hanifa may have wrote these theological works because it disagrees with their creed. As we shall note, ironically enough, the Mu'tazila also denied that Abu Hanifa wrote these works, and they said that it was not Abu Hanifa the great jurist Nu'man bin Thabit who wrote these works, but rather Abu Hanifa al-Bukhari. And they denied that Abu Hanifa wrote these works precisely because these works went against their creed and explicitly refuted them. And it's quite ironic because Salafis will accuse Ash'aris and Maturidis of being influenced by the Mu'tazila, but then in this regard they will be taking the same exact position as what the Mu'tazila took. Abu al-Muzaffar al-Isfarayini in At-Tabsir fi ad-Din mentions, and the book Al-Fiqh Al-Akbar is the one which was reported to us by reliable narrators with a relied upon path and an authentic chain from Yahya bin Nasr from Abu Hanifa. Az-Zubaydi mentions that in At-Tabsira al-Baghdadiyya it is mentioned, the first of the theologians of the people of the Sunnah from the jurists is Abu Hanifa. He authored in it Al-Fiqh Al-Akbar. Al-Qurduri in Dhayl al-Jawahir al-Madiyya fi Tabaqat al-Hanafiyya mentions, indeed the Mu'tazila claimed that the Imam did not have an authored work in the science of theology. As we mentioned, the Mu'tazila objected to this work, and their objected from that was negation of the fact that Al-Fiqh Al-Akbar, Al-Fiqh Al-Akbar, by the way, simply means the greater jurisprudence, because Abu Hanifa viewed that theology was the greater jurisprudence, or the greater kind of science in comparison to fiqh, jurisprudence, which relates to actions and rituals. And Al-Alim wa Al-Muta'allim were for him, meaning the Mu'tazila denied that these two works were written by Abu Hanifa, because he expressed clearly in both of them with most of the foundational principles of Ahlus Sunnah wal Jama'ah, meaning in this context primarily the fundamental beliefs of the Ash'aris, the Maturidis and the Atharis. And they said, indeed the Imam was a Mu'tazili, and both these books are for Abu Hanifa al-Bukhari, and this is a clear mistake, meaning this false attribution done by the Mu'tazila, first of all of their creed to Abu Hanifa and Nu'man bin Thabit, and second of all the false attribution of both of these works away from Abu Hanifa and Nu'man bin Thabit to Abu Hanifa al-Bukhari. And then the author mentions that this is a clear mistake. When we find his opinions in these treatises agree with his theological school, fundamentally the Maturidi school as adopted and developed by Abu Mansur al-Maturidi, who received his theological ideas from a chain of teachers going back to Abu Hanifa, that has reached us from other than these paths, meaning the paths from which Al-Fiqh Al-Akbar is narrated, and there is not in it what proves that these two books aren't in agreement with the Imam's views. Maulana Shams al-Milla wad-Din wal-Bir al-Taqi al-Imadi mentioned that these books are for Abu Hanifa, and a large group from the elderly scholars have agreed upon this. The author of Miftah as-Sa'ada also maintains that the Mu'tazila made this false claim regarding Abu Hanifa. Ibn Abu al-Izz in his commentary of Aqidah al-Tahawiyya mentions, Abu Hanifa named what he said and gathered in pages from the principles of the religion, Al-Fiqh Al-Akbar, the greater jurisprudence. The reality of this work is that his students recorded it from him and wrote it down and transmitted it. It's quite common within the pre-modern scholastic tradition that many times works that are attributed to scholars are actually written down by the scholar's respective students, and those students then record those ideas of his and then transmit those ideas in the form of a book. This doesn't mean that the book can't be attributed to the original author or the one who it's attributed to, because it's simply a collection of his ideas as recorded by his students. A very interesting note to be taken here is that it's very common within Islamic polemics and sectarian circles to constantly debate regarding whether certain books are attributable or reliably narrated or reported from certain authors or not. A similar case that occurs apart from the case of Abu Hanifa, whether he wrote Al-Fiqh Al-Akbar or not, in which the Mu'tazila and the Salafis deny that Abu Hanifa wrote it, and the Ash'aris and Maturidis say that he did write it. And what seems to be more historically sound is that Abu Hanifa did write this work. But apart from this case, we also have the case of Al-Ibana, the work of Al-Ash'ari. The Ash'aris say that this work has been tampered with. Salafis maintain that this was written at the end of Al-Ash'ari's life, and that this shows that he repented from his Ash'ari creed and turned back to pure Athari creed. However, the reality is that what the historical facts seem to point out is that this was a one-off work which Al-Ash'ari wrote in order to please the Hanbalis of Baghdad. And when it became clear that the Hanbalis of Baghdad weren't really happy with this work of his anyways, he then carried on following the Kullabi Kalami way, the theological methodology of Ibn Kullab, who was essentially his teacher in Ilm al-Kalam and the person who he took from after leaving the Mu'tazila school, and he developed the Ash'ari school after it. And it's very common in Islamic sectarian circles to deny certain books were written by certain authors, or to say that certain books have been tampered with, and that's due to the very obvious sort of argument that can be made that X, Y, and Z scholar said this and this, therefore he's part of this and this school of thought or not. And it's very interesting to see how authentic attribution of certain books to certain scholars or not plays a very important role within polemical and sectarian discourses.